Hello and welcome to our ValEUs Podcast series. My name is David Orlov from Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan. This podcast is part of the ValEUs project, the Jean Monnet Policy Network titled ValEUs, Research and Education Network on Contestation to EU Foreign Policy. It's founded from the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission for a 3-year period starting from January 2024. This ambitious project involving 20 partner institutions from 17 countries across 5 continents focuses on scrutinizing the foreign policy of the European Union and the challenges posed to its values. Today we are joined by Claske Vos, an anthropologist and assistant professor at the Department of European Studies at the Humanities Faculty of the University of Amsterdam. Hello Claske, how are you?
Hi, lovely to see you here, David.
Let me first introduce you to our audience. In her research, Claske focuses on the ways in which European institutions aim to employ cultural policy as means to transcend national identifications in accession states in Southeast Europe, particularly Bosnia and Herzegovina, Northern Macedonia, and Serbia. More general research interests are the anthropology of EU policy, European cultural policy, cultural heritage, Southeast Europe, Serbia, EU enlargement policy in Southeast Europe, the idea of Europe, and European identity formation. Correct?
Definitely.
So Claske,
Maybe I could add that more recently I've done more research on cultural activism within the former Yugoslavia, which is more the sort of latest trend that came from my earlier research on EU investments in culture in the former Yugoslavia. But that's really my latest work focuses on that.
well, that's great. And as you suggested, we will talk about contestation to EU foreign policy, intervention coming from the independent culture and arts scene in the former Yugoslavia. So to begin with, would you please introduce us to this scene?
Yeah, so maybe to give you a bit of background on how I got there, actually, because I did quite a large research project on EU funding that became available for the so-called Western Balkans. I mean, I prefer to call it the former Yugoslavia for several reasons, or Southeastern Europe. But I mean, they had culture as part of their policies related to enlargement. And I was interested in what was happening with that. So what I did is I was following the funding schemes that came from the different directorate generals. So either, from the enlargement and neighborhood policy, or those from culture and education. And I was simply following what was happening on the EU level. Why did Brussels or the different institutions wanted to invest in that? What would happen then when the programs came to rest in Serbia, in Bosnia, and in Macedonia? And what I realized rather quickly after mapping what was going on there, who was making use of the funds, for what kind of reasons were they making use of the funds, it turned out that it was mainly the independent, or the so-called independent cultural scene. So those cultural organizations or cultural workers that were operating independently from the institutional structures. And so that actually made me aware that there was actually quite a bit going on within the region of organizations, institutions that worked with international funding schemes. I mean, the European Union funding schemes is only one, of the sources that they use. And they actively use that to counteract a lot of the tendencies that they were facing within the context in which they were working. And so independent cultural scenes, how I understood it, and this has been existing for a very long time, and this is really not something that is just happening right now. It has a long history. But you see that there is, within the region, a counterforce coming from the culture and art scenes that tries to, by sort of circumventing the institutional pathways, by moving into other directions, than through the governmental means, tries to transform things that are very difficult to transform by other means. So they really try to, for example, use theater. They try to create cultural centers. They try to come up with all kinds of programs that still allow people to, for example, talk about ethnic differences, or that still allow minorities with a space to express themselves, or that allow the use of common resources in circumstances where the states are privatizing everything. So what they're really trying to do is to use channels, and in this case, it's been determined by culture and arts and everything sort of surrounded there, to facilitate and to create this kind of space that is shrinking within their local context. So this is sort of, giving you a bit of an idea of what I'm talking about, that it's a large community, it's a large group. In that sense, the demarcations are sometimes difficult because many of them can be also seen as civil society organizations, for example. But what marks them in my case is really their direct link to culture and arts, and their, I think, also strong positioning as acting independently.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I had a chance to uh, work with one of the cultural centers in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I know that such centers exist across the region, as far as I know, in Montenegro, in Croatia, and in Slovenia as well. And it started in Brussels and spread through the Balkan region, Western Balkan or Southeastern Europe. And yeah, it was a civil society center, but my concern was whether these centers really help to democratize the region, to challenge political status quo. And honestly, I'm not sure if they actually were directing at that goal, but on the other hand, they were mainly doing their daily shows, daily concerts, anti-fascist struggle, but in a very bubble way, like in their small community. So what do you think
Mm-hmm.
about that?
Well, I mean, that is definitely happening as well. I think I would agree, in some cases it's sort of preaching to the sort of choir, that is already established. Huh? So you do have those organizations that sort of reach the people that they will always reach and don't necessarily reach beyond. And then you can question, do they actually really bring democratization in a sort of broader sense? Really counteracting kind of the overall public sphere? Or are they sort of mainly cultivating these kind of critical thoughts within the communities that already share these kind of critical thoughts? So that's
Yes.
a bit what I hear you were saying. I think that, yeah, that's partially the case. You have these groups. I would say, though, that doesn't make them less important sometimes. No, I agree with you that there's reason to be critical about that in the sense that their outreach is perhaps not forceful enough. At the same time, it feeds the kind of community that otherwise might leave the country or might not even be there or might not even exist, and it still allows for a space that otherwise would not be there. So in many ways, I still think, even though these are performances to certain audiences or they reach particular, it's still actually really, really relevant, in particular looking at what's happening in Bosnia or in Serbia or in Montenegro, overall the region, where we see actually sort of the backsliding or the continuous sort of
Mhm.
threat of these kind of spaces continuing. But at the same time, I would also say these are certain initiatives, but I've also come across quite a few initiatives that do manage to reach much further, and that actually are bringing together much wider audiences and mobilizing people in interesting new ways. And we see that, for example, a lot when it comes to, for example, cultural initiatives that center around themes and topic that mobilize people sort of on a much wider scale. How we see that, for example, with the pollution of the rivers, the mining actually that's happening right now, these sort of topics that interfere in the daily lives of people on several levels, in several ways, actually manage to create, and then culture and arts is an interesting way of still creating a space where you also manage to create a space that is to some extent less determined by sort of the political atmosphere that creates immediate cutoff of any progress. We see here actually that things start to move. We also, I would say, see that now, even though it's, of course, an awful situation right now in Serbia, but we see also what happened there in relation to the collapse of the train station and the protests that happened there. And the cultural scene is very active there, together with a lot of other organizations. And here, I would say, we see a mobilization that has a force that goes beyond. And I fully agree, it's often very hard to say, is this direct democratization? The governments are not just going to change, from one to the other moment. And I think it's also an illusion to say, and we've seen that also, for example, in contexts like Ukraine or in the Arab Spring or elsewhere, because, of course, there have always been cultural organizations, trying to make things move. And very often you don't see the direct change of a government, or or that actually these organizations mobilize themselves politically and become integrated. You have a few exceptions, but you hardly see it. But they do create, I would say, a setting which makes democratization in the long term possible. It creates instances where people come together. It creates circumstances. Even there might be still some kinds of bubbles, but these bubbles allow actually for counter voices to emerge and to have a space where, otherwise they would not even exist. And you need those spaces because once things start to move, when there is an opening or when things are starting to slightly move, you need actually those forces. And they have been kept alive, by a lot of the initiatives that have been ongoing. So yeah, I agree with you. You have to be critical. And I guess we didn't even talk about that, that's a much bigger topic. But if you look, for example, at the growing right-wing movements, all over Europe, or if you think about other kinds of trends where we see also cultural actors being quite active. We also see the counter effect of these kind of things where it also mobilizes a nationalism, for example, where it can also, strengthen the voices that the other sort of the independent cultural scene really tries to counteract. So I think the play field is a very complicated one. But it is making things move in different ways. And that fascinates me. And it fascinates me particularly when you focus, for example, on Southeast Europe, where we see that the European Union is doing its utter best, to invest in these enlargement processes to make things move. And it comes and goes, and it has different effects at different places. And interestingly, through these, for example, in this case, these funding schemes, things are at least invested in a way that try to, on a ground level, really make things move, where the European Union, by other politics, finds it very hard, to change things. So it is an interesting, I would say, undercurrent that you should question, that you should be critical about, but that is actually quite essential to have, in the settings I've been working in.
I might be a little bit prejudiced in my question because I was talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, and as you said, it's not easy to challenge government, but in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's almost impossible. So that's why I'm a little bit prejudiced with regards to what they do at this cultural center, because it's a situation of hopelessness, and so they find some hope, at least in their daily struggles through cultural activism in these spaces. So yeah, of course.
No. And I think on top of that, I think it's important to keep in mind how precarious these organizations are. That actually, to get back to the Serbian case, I'm in touch with people on a rather regular basis. And we see police raids, on civil society actors now. We see sabotage of the cultural sector, happening right now. We see even expulsions, of people that have been active during the recent protests. And there is, reason as a cultural worker sort of trying to do these kind of, or make these kind of efforts, to really think, is it worth fighting? Because actually every step you take sort of bounces back with double force, and partially, what I think also, I've spoken with quite a few people working, of course, in this field, in this independent cultural scene. They have been active since the late 70s, 80s, many of them, so they were already very active when the conflicts in Yugoslavia were growing, where the tensions
Uh-huh.
were growing, the rising xenophobia, nationalism. And already then, a lot of these organizations were doing what they're still doing. Huh? And we talk really about a very long period. And they started off during these conflicts, and I can mention a lot of them. First of all, to really counteract the nationalism, of course, that was growing, the growing divisions that were happening. And they were fighting really hard. And then sort of in the beginning of 2000s, they got a lot of support, in particular from the Soros Open Society Foundation. A lot of civil society funding was flowing, in particularly into Bosnia and Herzegovina, but I would say all over the region. And this has also led to a really high dependency
Mm-hmm.
of these independent cultural actors on these kind of international funding schemes, and a government that didn't need to act, that was sort of waiting. Well,
Mm-hmm.
civil society is doing that because they get the funding. So there was also a very big gap emerging already early onwards between these kind of independent actors. And this is not just the cultural scene. This is, I would say, the entire civil society actor that started also to talk this very Western language, this kind of NGOization sort of, and by doing that, created their own bubble that we were talking about here, to
Mm-hmm.
some extent, creating a gap also between the population and these kind of groups in society. And then time was going on, and the Soros Foundation left
Mm-hmm.
because there were other conflicts to look after. A lot of the available funding schemes were sort of moving elsewhere. I was already saying you had conflicts in the Middle East, there were other urgent
Mm-hmm.
fires to look after, and then leaving an entire scene, independent cultural scene, that was working very hard, to sort of counteract what's going on, and did that for years, but was left with hardly any resources anymore, with a language, that they struggle with in terms of translating their priorities to the international community they were part of. And they also felt very, I would say, how to say, ambiguous about, because they also knew that the funders, they asked a lot of requirements that very often did not match exactly what they wanted to do or the circumstances they were working in. So you had an independent cultural scene that was sort of torn in between all these forces, and right now completely exhausted. They've worked
Mm-hmm.
since, like I said, the 70s up to nowadays, and many would argue the situation worsened since actually that period, if you look at the situation right now. So yeah, I think there's reason in many ways to be worried about this group, or to
Mm-hmm.
ask questions, also because the energy,
Yeah.
is sort of lacking, or it's hard, because what you're going to do is fighting against the force that sort of it's much easier to draw you back than to push you
Oh, yeah.
forward. At the same time, this is a group that also says, well, we will fight because we've nothing to lose. This is what we stand for, which makes them, again, also a very strong force. But they need, I would say, international collaboration, transnational networks, funding, sort of back up from other organizations, sort of collaborating. And we see this slowly happening.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that is in many ways a struggle. So it's a very important struggle, but it comes obviously with a lot of, how to say, sacrifices, or with quite a few, how to say, yeah, forces that continue to be very hard to fight.
Uh, yes, the point you mentioned about this exhaustion of the protest culture, it reminded me of recent scenarios in Belarus and Russia, in Far East Russia, when for a few months they were in the streets every
Mhm.
single day, and the government was still in power, and they at some point just lost hope. And what the
Yeah.
situation now in the Western Balkans like? Following the train station disaster in Novi Sad in Serbia, for a few months across the whole region there were protests. And what the situation is like right now, because I have not followed lately.
No, I mean it's growing repression of the government. So I mean it becomes increasingly difficult. It's going to stay, you know. I think there is a sort of determination that is incredibly admirable. But if we see what's happening and what the government is doing, it's becoming increasingly terrifying, you know, for people actually doing that. In also a context, and I was saying that before, where international support seems to be lacking, or at least, you know, there are some statements, there are statements of the European Parliament, there are statements made, you know, of international community, sort of we are standing behind and whatsoever, but they need support. I would agree in that sense. Yes, we see that sort of big energy growing with these kind of protests. We have had it in Turkey as well. I mean, we had several examples, I would say, of where we saw that there was this momentum, and also a very widely carried momentum where, you know, I remember also that there was a big march from Novi Pazar, for example, to Belgrade, you know, with protests, which was an unicum, you know, to really also bring in that part of Serbia as being part of this entire protest. And I do think, you know, things have been happening here that have, you know, also shown the strength of these kind of protests. But, you know, the government is not moving back, but it's feeling increasingly pressured. So on the one hand, you could say it has effect, because the fact that the government is feeling so incredibly threatened and is in that sense sort of fighting back with all full force, it shows, of course, that there is also a sense of being affected, of something that might move. But it's become incredibly difficult for many right now to continue, but they are continuing this fight.
And what's the ideological background of the cultural spaces and groups within the spaces that you study? For example, in my case, in Sarajevo, the group was united around anti-fascist values.
Mm-hmm.
What about your case? Is it maybe about European values, anti-fascist values? Well, what is it about, the ideological background?
Yeah. It's interesting, because I think if you would ask many what is your ideology, they would say, well, we'd rather stay away, you know, from that. But I understand, and I think anti-fascism is a shared theme for many reasons. Also because the historical ties it has with the region, it means so much more than just that. But so I do think that's something shared. But I think it's also very much about, you know, equality, solidarity, you know, also thinking of, it's very much against corruption, very much against the privatization, you know, also the clientelism, you know. I think it's about a shared need for a counterweight against these forces, you know, that actually have been dominating the country, like I said, since the 90s right now, and have been worsening. And I have the feeling, and this is at least amongst the different people that I work with, that's their main ambition. And many actually also gather, I would say, in independent cultural institutions that are nationwide. So you have the independent cultural scene in Serbia, you have them elsewhere, and they even have Platform Cooperativa, which is based in Zagreb, but represents the whole sort of scene of independent cultural workers or associations in the region, to also join forces, to have a better leverage. And we see that different visions there come together, where some indeed might focus more on this anti-fascist struggle, others focus more on minorities, yet others focus more on privatization, corruption, and to counteract all of that. And to really, join forces. And also what strikes me when I look at a lot of the independent cultural organization is their, I guess, to some extent, inclination to draw back on what Yugoslavia was. And that is to some extent a very, I would say, clear choice. Because if you say, you know, we are joining forces because, you know, we want to sort of think back in lines of what former Yugoslavia was, it was a transnational space. And of course, you could talk a lot about the nostalgia of that, of
Mhm.
what was and what is right now. But it's also a kind of protest against the separation that we see, in
Mm.
Bosnia is, I would say, the worst case here, where we really see the ethnic division becoming increasingly institutionalized. But I would say all over the region, that sort of xenophobia or nationalism that is still very much determining what's going on, to actually say we're going to draw on Yugoslav part, and we're going to emphasize the bonds that we always had across borders. And in particular, the culture and art scene was quite, or the independent then in this case, was quite determined by that. And I see quite a lot of initiatives, like the establishment of the women resistance. That's one
Mhm.
initiative of Crvena in Bosnia, for example. That they make an archive of this past, because otherwise it will
Mhm.
be forgotten.
Yeah.
Or I know in Macedonia that there's an organization that is really trying to revitalize the abandoned socialist buildings, and we see that all over
Mhm.
the region. The abandoned
Yeah.
socialist factories, because they were drawing a community and they were going across borders, and they were actually also um, something that was still cherished before historical revisionism took place. So to actually really emphasize the Yugoslav past in many ways, so literally and metaphorically, is, I would say, something that to me also unifies a lot of the organizations there, which I think is connected to the broader wish of alternative
Mhm.
futures. So the Yugoslav past is a way to envisage an alternative future, is a way of moving out of the current situation and to radically imagine, I would say, because it's of course hoping for a better future. It's not an existing future. To get back to what you were saying at the beginning, is it really democratizing things? Maybe not, but at least it allows people to elaborate on what could possibly become, in the future, and drawing on the past or drawing on alternatives, drawing on commons, other kinds of models is a way of doing that.
It's really interesting because in a way you've just summarized my PhD dissertation.
Well,
With nostalgia and hoping for alternative futures, it's exactly what my respondents were talking about in Sarajevo in one of the cultural centers.
yeah. And I think that's really what binds them. Whether it's an ideology, it's at least an encouragement, or it's something that gives them the energy to keep on doing what they're doing, despite, and I already said that, the enormous challenges that they're facing. There needs to be an idea of an alternative future, and I think that is really what joins all these actors in the field.
Yes, this kind of cultural spaces definitely increase the capacity for aspiration for these people in the
Yeah,
region, especially youth, I would say.
yeah, yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. I hope our audience
Yes,
would
we
like
could
it
go
as
on
well.
for way longer.
Yeah, of
Also,
course.
about what does the European Union do with that? But hopefully,
Yeah.
this gave a little bit of an insight in what I've been doing here. And I think it's actually very interconnected also with contesting EU values and international foreign relation, where we see that this is yet another force in the field that is actively trying to work with that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we would definitely talk a lot more if we would have a chance to meet earlier this month in Amsterdam.
Sure, sure. Yes, we'll keep
But
that for the next time then.
yes, next time. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll stop recording here.